that there might actually be some people listening, maybe online, or even some people in the church whom I've not met yet. I do my best to get back to the back and meet people, and sometimes I just don't get to. So I figured I would just introduce myself. My name is Shawn, and most people here just call me Shawn, though. And for the past 9 years, I've been one of the full-time pastors here at Pond Hill. However, I've been at this church for almost 30 years because this is actually the church that I grew up in. My father's been the pastor here for as long as I've been around, and because of that, I've had the opportunity to lead events, to perform on stage, and to serve this congregation for many, many years. And because of that, I have just watched people lead in lots of different ways. And so ever since I was a little kid, my parents not only taught me how to interact with people, which every parent should be doing with their kid, but also how to lead people, because I grew up in a family of leaders. And so I got to grow up watching not just them lead the church, though, as well, but many other people throughout the years take leadership roles in the church. And I got to see some key individuals who stepped up in some really amazing ways growing up. And so that was kind of the environment that I grew up in. Before I was hired here, I spent 3 summers interning here as well. And one of the primary things we did during those was leadership training. And maybe some of you, depending upon your job, have gone through some of these leadership trainings. Some of them were specifically for church leadership, but many of them are headed by like CEOs or business coaches, and they've just spent sort of a lifetime teaching generic leadership training. And so as you might imagine, I've gone through a lot of these trainings, and I've picked up a few things. I don't claim to be like a perfect or even great leader necessarily, but along the way, I've definitely picked up a few tricks. And so there are types of things that leadership training give you. Oftentimes, it's not like niche enough to really tell you exactly how to lead your like congregation, but what it does do is it gives you these tools for like communication and conflict resolution and building a team and stuff like that. So generic tricks that you can kind of take and use. Now, I'm a little leery to share this trick that I'm going to share with you because I feel like next time I use the trick, you're going to know what it is now. It's like a back door into it because this is a trick that I've used a bunch of times, and it's important that you realize that just because it's like a trick, just because it's a method, doesn't make it less genuine. It's the way that we structure. So it's all still the truth, just the way that we structure the truth, okay? So I just need to say that disclaimer there. So with that out of the way, here's some free leadership training for you guys here. Now, this usually costs a lot of money, but you guys came on the right Sunday. You're going to get it for free. There's this thing, it's a great correction tool, and it's called the compliment sandwich. The compliment sandwich. Does anybody know what the compliment sandwich is? Has anybody heard of this before? Well, yes, of course you know what it is. The compliment sandwich. Very important. This is a way to offer critique or correction to somebody on your team. And it's a great way to sort of package it. And I try to do all of my critiquing with this method. More importantly for myself, this is now how I structure every single email that I write with the compliment sandwich. And so this is a great trick. So let me kind of explain what this is. Basically, if you have to offer critique to someone, you put the critique in the middle, but you start and end with a compliment towards that person. So let's say maybe someone is constantly like showing up late. Not that anybody ever shows up late here at Pond Hill. But let's say one of your volunteers is showing up late. This is just an arbitrary, totally random example. It goes somewhat like this, right? Here we go. Thank you so much for helping out that new team member today. I really appreciate that. I did notice that you were about 20 minutes late today. Please make sure you show up on time next week at the appropriate time. Once we got started, you did a great job. Keep up the good work. That's the compliment sandwich. Compliment, critique, compliment. That's how it works. And so what you need to address goes in the middle, but it's kind of like wrapped in good vibes. That's my explanation of how it works. So it's not my trick. It's not my trick at all. Like this isn't wisdom from me. This is like everybody says to do this. If you go to leadership training, they'll teach you about this. But I sure do use it as much as I can. And like I said, all of my emails always start and end with thank you. And I guarantee that less people will be upset with you based on your emails if you use the compliment sandwich in your emails. So it's literally, little tricks like this. They can help you become a better leader or communicator. And Jesus was a master at both of these things. He was a very good leader, very good communicator. In fact, the New Testament authors writing about Jesus were also masters at little trick like this. And our guy Mark, who we've been studying, is no exception to this rule. Just like last week, the first thing I want to talk about before we jump into this passage is the form of the passage. And I know that some of you might not understand exactly why I always take time to talk about this, but I really, really believe that every single word of Scripture is written with immense intentionality. And that these words, the stories, not only even the words used to tell the stories, but the order and the structure of those words used to tell those stories is important, and it's part of the message that the Bible has to give us. In fact, I think that once we understand the form of these texts, it's easier to understand what exactly the author is trying to communicate through them as well, because it's not just the words that communicate, it's also what's said, what's not said, the order of what's said, and all this cool stuff that we're going to talk about in here. So forgive the nerding out, but it's part of the process. And today is a significantly less complicated passage than the one we studied last week. So that's good. So you can wipe the sweat off your brow. It's exciting. So as we look at Mark 14, 1 through 11, that's where we're going to be. If you have your scriptures, you could open up to it as well. Mark 14, 1 through 11 is clearly demarcated from the rest of the chapter. We've got sort of this main section, but it's surrounded by troubling words. And so it's the main section of it is Mark 14, 3 to 9, but Mark 1 to 2 and Mark 11 to or 10 to 11 are important for what's going on. So as we know, Jesus has been stirring up trouble. And so what we encounter in this passage is not unlike the compliment sandwich. It's a different kind of sandwich, though. I've called it the violence sandwich. And if you think that sounds dramatic, this is a downgrade from what I wanted to call it, because I wanted to call it a murder sandwich, but I thought that was too over the top. So listen to how, look at how the form of this is just like our compliment sandwich, except like a negative example of it. As we know, Jesus has been stirring up trouble in Jerusalem. He's kind of entered the city. He's had a lot of dialogical battles with the religious leaders, the political leaders, and the scholastic leaders of Jerusalem. And they're sort of already weary of in their eyes, this would-be Messiah when Jesus comes to town. So they're asking him questions designed to entrap or expose him. And every time, Jesus very masterfully not only dodges the attacks, but reroutes them towards his opponents. And so now the leaders of Jesus' day are not only threatened by him, but they've also been embarrassed by Jesus. Right? They've also lost some clout with their followers, and quite frankly, they're angry. They've made fools of themselves. They understand that, and they're actually angry about it. And so Jesus, once he leaves, it's sort of framed this way, he leaves the main city for a second to go have a meal with his friends in Bethany, which was just a short while away from the main city. And this is what it says, what is happening back in Jerusalem in Mark 14, 1 through 2. It says this: "After 2 days was the feast of Passover and of unleavened bread, and the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might take him by craft and put him to death. And they said, not on the feast day, lest there be an uproar with the people." So while we're graced with Jesus' battle with the religious leaders of Jerusalem, Jesus' main reason for going to Jerusalem in the first place was not just a duel with his opponents. Jesus was in Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. And this is like the ideal for a Jewish person, is to go and celebrate Passover in Jerusalem. In fact, even today, even like modern Jews today, their ideal for Passover would be to do it in Jerusalem. And so that's why Jesus is there. He's there to celebrate. But once he gets there, he encounters these leaders, and they do sort of their rhetorical battle, and they're already ready to kill Jesus. But the problem is there's a bunch of tourists in Jerusalem celebrating Passover. And so they're afraid that if they do it before Passover with all these people here, it's going to be a big problem for them. But at this point in the story, in Mark 14, Jesus is living on borrowed time. He's already marked for death. They're just biding their time for the meal to be over so they can go and get him. In fact, after the main story in Mark 14, 3 through 9, we're going to skip to the end, the other side of it. We learn that even among Jesus' closest friends, there is violence to be found. By the end of the story, in Mark 14, 10 to 11, it says this, "And Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went unto the chief priests to betray him unto them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money, and he sought how he might conveniently betray him." Yes, by the end of our passage today, Judas will come to the realization that the way of Christ is not the way for him. He'll realize that this is not what he bargained for. Ultimately, his way, this is his realization, his way and Jesus' way are incompatible. So we have this violent sandwich, right? The story we're about to read is couched in between these two dark accounts of people who are wanting to at least do some sort of violence to Jesus. Whether Judas is anticipating his death or not is not specifically said in the story, but obviously his betrayal of Jesus is exactly what leads to his death. It actually lines up, this story actually lines up with a very common theme throughout the book of Mark, and it's one of the common themes that we can see based on the way that Mark structures his gospel. And this is no different. The fact that this story is couched between these other two accounts is important, and it's an important framework for discussing the passage. So the reality is that you're hearing this message because you believe, or at least suspect, that Jesus actually is who he claims to be, right? Especially in Mark, he claims to be a new king, bringing a new kingdom. And his way of life cannot be found somewhere else, and it's contrary to the way of the world. It's contrary to the way that we might decide to live our own lives. But the way of Jesus is something that we largely believe is true, right? We believe that that's a true thing, and that's why we're here listening to this. According to Jesus, repentance means turning away from our own way of living, instead living in accordance with his kingdom. This is the gospel, right? We know this. This is the gospel. Turning away from our own way of doing things and following Jesus into his new kingdom is what we're all about, right? And Judas and the religious leaders failed to do this. Ultimately, they end up wanting their own way. They wanted to maintain their own power, their own comfort. They held to their own agenda, and they're building their own kingdom and worshiping that instead of letting Jesus be their king. That's sort of the dichotomy that we're seeing here. This is the dichotomy of the whole book of Mark. That's the gospel. We can't do things our own way. Instead, we need to follow Jesus and let him be the king. So following Jesus ultimately means living in a way that lines up with his kingdom, and that's what it means to follow him. In fact, he fleshes out what it means to live in his kingdom for the whole book of Mark. In fact, the whole Bible itself is this idea of what does it look like to live as part of God's kingdom instead of living my own way. In order to get there, to live in line with the kingdom, it means to surrender your own way and make time to serve Jesus. So let's leave. This is kind of like the framework with which we're going to read this story. So what I want to do is just read through the story together. It's not that long. It starts in verse 3. "And being in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at meat, there came a woman having an alabaster box of ointment and spikenard, very precious, and she broke the box and poured it over on his head. And there were some that had indignation within themselves and said, 'Why have we wasted this ointment? For it might have been sold for more than 300 pence and have been given to the poor.' And they murmured against her. And Jesus said, 'Leave her alone. Why trouble you her? She's wrought a good work on me. For you have the poor with you always, and whensoever ye will, you may do them good. But me you don't always have. She hath done what she could. She has come aforehand to anoint my body to the burying. Verily I say unto you, wheresoever this gospel shall be preached throughout the whole world, this also that she hath done shall be spoken of for me, for a memorial of her.'" If there's one thing you should come away with after reading this passage, we're gonna dive into it a little bit, but if there's one thing that you should come away with in this passage, that this woman is the good guy. She is the positive example of what this is. Now, there's a parallel account of this in the Gospel of John. And the Gospel of John identifies this woman as Mary, the sister of Martha. And so we're going to just refer to her as Mary. So Mary is the one living in line with the kingdom in this story. That's what should be the clearest thing about reading this passage. I mean, Jesus ultimately is the good guy, right? But the idea is that she has chosen to live in accordance with the kingdom. And actually, kingdom, that sort of idea of the kingdom is very present in this passage. Not only does Jesus contrast Mary with those who were indignant, is how the scripture says, right? These apostles, which, by the way, again, John actually identifies this group of people murmuring against her as being led by Judas Iscariot himself. And so not only is she contrasted with the Judas and a group of disciples who are bad-mouthing her, but also, where does Mary pour this perfume? You might, if you're familiar with this story, you might remember in John's account, Mary pours it on Jesus' feet and washes his feet with her hair. Has anybody maybe heard that story before? But it seems that Mark has chosen to include the detail that Mary actually puts the perfume on Jesus' head. And of course, both of those things could be true, right? I mean, she poured the whole bottle on him, right? So she probably just did both of those things. But what Mark has chosen to highlight is that Mary has put this perfume on Jesus' head, which has a very distinct idea that goes along with it in Judaism. If you've read through the Tanakh, right, which is the first part of our Bible, you'll see that every godly king of Israel is anointed by a prophet to lead with oil placed on his head. And so as Mary comes into this situation and anoints Jesus on the head with this expensive perfume, I think what Mary is doing is acknowledging Jesus as a king, Jesus as the Messiah. She's going out of her way to anoint his head. And it was common for the host of a house to wash their guests' feet. It's kind of gross, but it was common that happened. But Mary not only does that, but also anoints his head as well. So many of the things that Mark is doing in this passage is elevating Mary over the religious leaders in Judas, whom we just read about at the beginning and end of this passage, right? So the design of this passage is to contrast Mary's faith with the violence of the religious leaders and Judas himself. I'm not sure what sent Judas over the edge specifically, but something about the conversation that happens here is what sends Judas over the edge, literally, in fact. As I was reading in preparation for this sermon, scholars have a lot of different opinions on why exactly Jesus did what he did and said what he did. It's very it's not totally clear what exactly pushes Judas. Like, this is the straw that makes Judas go and talk to the religious authorities. So what about this conversation does that for Judas? We're not sure. Some say that Judas, because he was the keeper of the purse, wanted this ointment to be sold for money so that he could take some of that money for himself. Some people just kind of say, okay, he was, hoping to make a little money on the side. Some say maybe that this was the moment that Judas realized that Jesus wasn't going to launch an attack into Jerusalem and throw out the Romans. Like, this was the moment that Judas realized that Jesus wasn't the Messiah whom he thought that Jesus was. Some say that it's just that Judas is embarrassed by this rebuke that Jesus gives and in favor of Mary's work. Whatever the case is, it's clear that Judas is officially not in line with the kingdom. I think we can all agree. We already knew that coming into here. We're not learning anything new by that. But Mary has figured this thing out, at least on this moment. On Mother's Day this year, I preached a sermon about what it means to be great in Jesus' kingdom. And it's got Mark has a really specific word, and Jesus uses this specific word when he says that to be greatest means to be the servant of all. And that word servant, diakonia, is used very sparingly in the book. And one time it's used with reference to the way that angels serve Jesus. Once it's used to reference Jesus himself serving. But every other time the word is used in the book of Mark, it's always used to talk about a woman who is serving. And in Mark's gospel, the only people who serve like Jesus serves are women. The only ones who truly get what Jesus is trying to do, who truly get what it means to be great in the kingdom, are women. Now, don't, I've already preached a whole sermon about this, so I don't want to get too deep into it. Mark is doing something here, though, and the trick that Mark is using is like this. The men in Mark's gospel kind of suck. The men in Mark's gospel, they're not great. They're not painted in great light. We're about to reach the crucifixion, and guess where the disciples are as Jesus gets arrested and crucified? Your guess is as good as mine, but they're not there at the cross with Jesus. Who is there, though? A group of very devoted women who are ready to anoint Jesus' body for burial. Those are some of the women that serve like Jesus served. Guess who swears they won't deny Jesus and then does it 3 times? Jesus' best buddy, Peter, right? Guess who betrays Jesus to the authorities? One of Jesus' other best buddies, Judas, who we're reading right now. Guess who ultimately hangs Jesus on the cross? The male-only leaders of the temple and the local arm of the Roman government. Now, I'm not saying that every woman in Mark is perfect, and I'm not saying that being a woman automatically makes you perfect. Sorry, girls, for that message. But what I am saying is that women of faith are highlighted as examples of what it means to live in line with the kingdom here in Mark. And today we're like, yeah, of course, women can achieve kingdom greatness, but keep in mind that 100 years ago, women couldn't even vote in this country. So think about what it was like 2,000 years ago when this was written. What Mark is doing by elevating women over and above the men who fail in his book is extremely countercultural. And for the original readers of this book, it would have been a huge shock to read some of this stuff. So let me remind you that Jesus' kingdom is unlike any other. It's totally, radically, inextricably different than anything we've got now and anything they had then. It's a totally new kingdom, and it demands that you surrender your own way. Your own way of thinking will not fit, right? Your own way of living will not fit. Your way of perceiving the world around you will not fit. And something about Jesus' female disciples, they picked this up like the other people of the time didn't. So living in line with the kingdom means surrendering your own way. But what exactly does Mary do to live this out? The reality is that there's a lot of ways to surrender your own way and live differently. There's a lot of ways to live this out. In fact, the whole of the gospel is filled with Jesus talking about all these different ways that you can live in line with the kingdom. And so we're just not going to be able to talk about them all today. But I think what gets to the heart of how Mary is living this out here has to do with making time to serve Jesus. Living in line with the kingdom means surrendering your own way and making time to serve Jesus. Now, I think this is on display through what Jesus says in his response to this. And I think this is also like the hardest part of the passage, so we're going to talk about that for a little while. If you start in verse 4, it says this, and there were some that were indignant within themselves, and they said, "Why has this waste of the ointment been made? For it might have been sold for more than 300 pence, which, by the way, was about a year's worth of labor." That was like a lot of money at that time. 300 pence, and have been given to the poor, and they murmured against her. And Jesus' response, "Let her alone. Why trouble ye her? She's wrought a good work on me. For you have the poor with you always, and whensoever ye will, you may do them good. But me ye have not always. She hath done what she could. She has come aforehand to anoint my body to burying." Like many of the conversations that we've looked at in the last couple of months, Jesus has taken the opportunity here to prophesy about his death. He's been trying to prepare his disciples for a long time that at some point, I'm going to die, and you're going to be left with my ministry. Like, he's been trying to do that basically since the beginning of the book with his disciples, and they're just super not getting it. It seemed like everybody was caught off guard when Jesus gets arrested. I'm not even convinced that Mary herself understands that that is something that she's doing here. I'm convinced that even she would have been caught off guard when Jesus was arrested. Nonetheless, what Mary does here is remarkable for several reasons, and Jesus' response to it is so interesting. Like, especially in verse 7, when he says, "For you will have the poor with you always, and whensoever ye will, you may do them good. But me ye have not always." The preface to this conversation that we're about to have is that Jesus is actually really into serving the poor. So don't misread this verse. Like, he's already demonstrated so many times in his ministry that he's really into feeding the poor. Like, he's not dismissing our responsibility to care for the poor. He's very into that. And Judas's concern for the poor, which might even be feigned in the first place, is what Jesus is combating here. In fact, we've got this contrast between Judas's concern for the poor and Mary's extravagant act of service. I think one of the helpful frames for this is actually a story that we've already looked at, because I think what's happening here is a parallel account to something that happened in Mark chapter 12. You might remember a few weeks ago that we talked about the widow and two mites. Is there anybody remember that story? It's a great story. We talked about it a little bit. Jesus is observing the temple treasury, where there was sort of these boxes on the side of the temple where people would come and they would bring their offering. And remember, it's all coins, and the boxes were metal. And so when people put the coins in, it would make this big, loud noise. And so he was observing rich people come up and just dump coins into these and give. And they made kind of a big show of it. And there was a poor widow, though, that came up sort of in the mix of that. She drops in 2 mites, which is kind of like a penny in our money, although they've been saying that since like the 70s, so maybe it's like $1 now, I don't know. Whatever it is, right? A little tiny bit of money she drops in the account. Jesus, nobody notices her, but Jesus says that that widow is actually the one who is generous here, right? He highlights that her service is extraordinary because she didn't give out of surplus, but she gave everything that she had. It wasn't showy. It wasn't about gaining clout with other people. From the outside, you wouldn't have even noticed how generous that really was. But the proportion with which she gave was extravagant. So who was in line with the kingdom, right? The rich people giving just for show, or the widow who gave everything she had? I think this is a really similar story to that. When Judas says, you could have sold this and given all that money to the poor, I think we can draw a connection between his objection and the rich giving out of their excess for show. Because to care for the poor was actually a big deal in Judaism, especially during a feast. In fact, to care for the poor during Passover would have been a great way not only to serve them, but also to gain the attention of all the people that are pouring into Jerusalem here. And so when Jesus says, you will always have the poor, and whenever you want to, you can do them good, I think he might actually be calling them into action. Like, he's not saying don't serve the poor. He's saying don't only serve the poor during Passover times when it's cool to do it, but also take the year's worth of opportunities to serve the poor. Just because doing it right now is the in thing or the thing that would gain you the most attention doesn't mean it's the only time that we should care. And I think some of that is going on beneath the surface here. I think Jesus is seeing a bit of that empty religion that he's been combating for the last, in our terms, couple months as we've been seeing it. And I think Judas' concern here is probably feigned in the moment, and he's putting up a religious concern in order to gain approval of the other disciples nearby, which he does because he starts this kind of like all these whispers going on about Mary. But besides Jesus' war on empty religion, there's another angle to highlight here that I think is really important for us today. Jesus is pleased with what Mary does, so much so that he gives this great honor in verse 9, where he says, "Verily I say unto you, wheresoever this gospel shall be preached throughout the whole world, this also that she hath done will be spoken of as a memorial to her." So as we're going through and planning our sermon series for Mark, Jesus has commanded us that we have to talk about this when we go through Mark. Because Jesus has said every time the gospel is preached, this should be a piece of it, which is really high honor for Jesus to give. Keep in mind that Jesus is really into serving others, right? Poor people, sick people, young people, even his enemies are all worthy of love and service in Jesus' eyes. But this interaction shows us that Jesus also values being served. And this is important, right? Because we know that Jesus was God in the flesh. And service to God was something that ancient Israelites were very familiar with. In fact, their whole religion revolved around taking intentional times off, both once a week and several special times throughout the year, in order to just be with and serve God. They would say certain prayers, cook certain foods, offer certain sacrifices, all in service of God. And as Jesus is on the road to the cross, he takes a moment to remind us that, like they have done for centuries, like they're about to do at the Passover dinner that they'll have later in this chapter, serving God is just as important as serving others. And because he is God, Jesus is worthy of that service. Now, I've been known to conflate serving others with serving God, to say that they're the same thing. And that's from Jesus, right? Jesus says, if you give somebody who's thirsty a glass of water, it's like you gave it to me. And so Jesus himself, he conflates these two things, but he also here, I believe, is drawing a distinction between aiming our service at other people and aiming our service at him. It's appropriate not only to take time to serve others, but also to take time and just be with and serve Jesus. For Mary, this meant anointing Jesus with her most expensive perfume. So what are some practical ways that this might look for us? Like to take time not only to serve other people, but to serve Jesus as well. And honestly, there are endless ways to do them, right? Like Mary, I think generosity is one of those things, right? The giving of our resources to God is a fantastic way to praise him. Another might be spending time in gratitude. You could do a prayer walk where the only thing that you're allowed to say is thanks to God for various things. You could write a journal entry about how good God is, much like many of the Psalms. You could go around the table at a family meal and speak things that you're grateful for. When I was in college, I had a pastor. He was really big on this idea of dating Jesus, which I know sounds kind of scandalous to many of us. It was the type of thing that he would say. But I actually think the concept is really good. And, I guess I shouldn't assume necessarily that all of us know how to date well, but when I was being taught how to date, the biggest thing that the date was for was spending intentional time with your date and giving them your full attention for whatever that amount of time. Like, you could hang out with your significant other doing anything, right? Like, you could be doing chores and you guys are hanging out, whatever. That's still quality time. But a date is when you spend like all of your attention for a couple hours on this person. And so he would talk about dating Jesus, saying there's time in the calendar to just be with Jesus, give him 100% of your attention for a few hours. And so I don't know what that exactly looks like, right? Most of the time it's scheduled in advance. It's in the calendar. It's marked off. This is time for me and Jesus. What if you were to go to a coffee shop and then walk through a garden and then go home and bake some cookies with Jesus? I don't know if that's your ideal date, but for me it sounded romantic, so that's what I wrote down. Whatever it is, if there was some set aside time for spending time with Jesus in your week, I think that's sort of what my pastor at the time was getting at. Last week, I showed you guys pictures of a hike that I went on, which I did primarily for fitness reasons. However, it wasn't only for fitness reasons, right? Once I got up to the peak, I wanted to read my Psalm for Life group and also the Olivet Discourse. And I think that's kind of an example of what I'm talking about, where it's like, this is the only thing I'm doing right now. I'm going to get up there, I'm going to sit down, and I'm just going to spend some time just with Jesus without interruptions. Another thing that jumps out to me is what you're doing right now, what you guys right now are doing. You're already doing it right. If the way of Jesus was about serving others only, then I think that getting together once a week for service would be kind of weird. Because a lot of what we do here doesn't have to do with serving others. It has more to do with serving God, especially like the music. Like when we sing, we're not like out serving the community by our singing. I mean, you can do that. You can go like caroling or something like that to do that. But what we're doing more so is spending our attention and our voices on giving praise to God just for who he is. As the person that picks most of the music here, one of the very specific things I do is make sure that we are singing not just about what God has done for me, but also about who God is. That our songs are not just about like, God, come and rescue us from whatever we're going through, or God, thank you so much for what you've done. Those are all great things to sing about, don't get me wrong. But also singing, saying, God, you are great. you are a good God, and I want to just praise you for who you are, right? And that's one of the things that we try to do. And the reason we do that is because we don't just think that serving other people is important. We think that praising God, that serving Jesus is also important. And showing up on a Sunday, I think, is a great opportunity to take time out of your week to just say, I want to praise Jesus. It's not the only thing that happens on a Sunday, right? We like connecting with each other, and we believe that the family of God is really, really important and integral to what it means to be part of the kingdom, right? But we're also taking time to praise God. And perhaps one of the things that might lead to this, I might get in trouble for saying this, one of the things that might lead to this is valuing being here on time enough to sing at the beginning. Just saying, right? Maybe that's one of the ways that we could do this. Part of living in line with the kingdom is not just serving others, but also serving God. And this kind of service is not always what makes you popular. In fact, most people will not even know that you're doing these things. If somebody sees you alone at a coffee shop, they're just going to think you're alone at the coffee shop. This is not the kind of thing that's going to make you popular among your friends, or it's not even going to make you necessarily look like religious, if that's something that you're into looking. It's not glamorous. In fact, like I said, most people won't even know what you're doing. Nonetheless, it is absolutely vital to the life of the kingdom. And I hope that as we talk about this, you've actually come up with some ways that you can serve Jesus this week. Like, I hope that's what's going through your mind already, like how you can do that. Maybe you've already booked some time with him and thought about where in the week that fits. Maybe you've already started to plan a date or hope that at least you've made time to be here next week. And perhaps for you, it looks like just showing up. Maybe it's a mental shift that says that when I'm singing, what I'm doing is giving my full attention to God. What Mary does for Jesus is truly remarkable here. I mean, so much so that Jesus requires it be included in conversations about the gospel. Jesus commands us to tell her story. And in his mind, Mary is one of the few disciples who actually understood what he was about. Like I said, she probably didn't have everything right all the time. But in this moment, we see that she truly does get what the kingdom is about. And her extravagant display reminds us to leave behind empty religion and serve Jesus. Her faith in Jesus stands in stark contrast to the empty religion that Jesus had been critiquing during his whole ministry, but especially during this last week in Jerusalem. And in Mary, we find an example of what it looks like to be in line with the kingdom. That living in line with the kingdom means surrendering your own way and making time to serve Jesus. Let's pray.